Thank you very much, Suelen. Thank you very much, Erika. And congratulations, especially to our colleagues from RMIT, for organizing this wonderful and this very, very necessary event. Okay, I think this is a wonderful idea, a wonderful occasion for us to meet, and I am absolutely delighted and honored to have been invited to give this keynote speech today. But I also feel a great responsibility, okay? Because this is not only the topic of research, my main topic of research nowadays, but this is a commitment that I have for life. I would like to contribute to improve the life of women who go through this suffering, and this is why I feel a lot of responsibility today to pass on the message that we really need to be trained and specialized if we want to do a proper job, okay? So today, in my presentation, I will be, first of all, focusing on the phenomenon of violence against women, first of all. Then I will talk about the impact of gender-based violence on migrant and refugee women. I will talk a little bit about victims' rights, especially linguistic rights. And I would also go into the need for training and for a specialization, which I think, is the most important part of my presentation. The other part is more as a way of introduction. While I was preparing for this talk, I was looking for some information and figures on the Australian context. And I found that on average, 1 woman a week is murdered by her current or former partner in Australia. 1 in 3 Australian women have experienced physical violence since the age of 15. 1 in 5 Australian women have experienced sexual violence. 1 in 6 Australian women have experienced physical or sexual violence by current or former partner. 1 in 4 Australian women have experienced emotional abuse by a current or former partner, and almost 1 in 10 have experienced violence by a stranger since the age of 15. So the figures are really shocking, I think. But look at the European Union figures. This report done by the Fundamental Rights Agency in 2004 said that 1 in 3 women, that is 33% of the women population in the European Union, have experienced physical and sexual violence since she was 15 years old, okay? Now, I have underlined the words, physical, sexual. I've underlined the word emotional, whatever. And this has a lot to do with the definition of violence against women, okay? When I was looking for information on Australia, I found that most of the terms used to describe the phenomenon of violence against women is domestic violence, family violence, intimate partner violence, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, okay? These are the words that we use to describe the phenomenon. In Spain, we have a pioneer law, a law that has even won, prizes given by the United Nations. And even though the name is gender-based violence, it only refers to the violence perpetrated by a man against a woman, okay? And between them, there has to be an emotional bond, an emotional relationship. Okay? So according to this law in Spain, if you are raped by a stranger in the street, you are not considered to be a gender violence victim. Okay? If you are, look at this definition given by Lorente. A woman is attacked because she is a woman, not because she is a wife, a mother, or a homemaker. For this reason, abuse often begins prior to commencement of the family or domestic relationship during courtship, and does not end when the domestic or family relationship is terminated. We should therefore not confuse the means with the motives. The family or domestic relationship is only the setting in which cohabitation between a man and a woman occurs. And that is why it is the most frequent context where violence against women is perpetrated, but it's not the only one. Look at all the other forms of violence against women. What about genital mutilation? This many times is perpetrated by the family, by the mothers even, or the grandmothers against their own daughters, okay? What about forced marriages? This is also done in the family, but it's not perpetrated by a man against a woman. It's the society, it's the family, okay, who perpetrates it. Honor killings, and of course prostitution, you know, human trafficking for sexual exploitation, which is, I believe, one of the most extreme forms of violence against women. And it's nothing to do with the domestic sphere, it's nothing to do with the family sphere, and it's nothing to do with sentimental relationships, okay? So this is a very important issue to be taken into account, because I believe words make reality, okay? So if we talk about domestic violence, if we talk about family violence, it looks as if it's something that has to do with the private sphere, and it's not. This is a public issue, and as such, it has to be addressed by the authorities, by the states, okay? This is why I always like the definition given by the United Nations on violence against women, which is any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women. And this now is very important, including threats of such act, okay, coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty. And this is also, again, very important, whether occurring in public or in private life. I think, you know, the United Nations is the right definition. I think the Spanish one is definitely wrong. I don't know, you know, about the Australian one. Maybe it will have to, you know, fine-tune a little bit. Okay, the World Health Organization said and described violence against women as a significant public health problem, a violation of human rights that affects more than 1/3 of women globally. So 1 in every 3 women, of the ones that are sitting here, are probably victims of this terrible crime. And then another of the conclusions of this report is that the prevalence of violence against women constitutes a global public health problem of epidemic proportions requiring urgent action. Now, there is a lot of legislation since the end of the Second World War, since the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. There is a lot of legislation to prevent and to combat this terrible crime. I'm not going to go through all the legal text. I have a publication in 2017 that reviews all the legislation on gender violence. And this is really fantastic, but a lot has to be done yet. Nothing, we have improved a little bit, but there are still a lot of gaps in the legislation. For example, there is a lot of inequalities in society, right? There is a lot of impunity. A lot of perpetrators are held unaccountable. And one of the biggest gaps in the legislations, I believe, is the lack of attention to most vulnerable women, right? Now, deaf women, elderly women, and of course, migrant women. Okay, migrant women have, as we all know, added barriers, okay? They carried a backpack full of stones, right? Not only the stone of gender violence, which is one of the heaviest ones, but they also lack of established family networks, support systems, and community structures. They suffer from distress arising from refugee status and prior experience of torture and trauma. They also suffer from uncertainty or fear concerning visa or immigration status sometimes. They can also suffer from differences in cultural beliefs and practices regarding what is respectable and equitable relationships between men and women, okay? They also sometimes suffer from shame or fear of exclusion from communities, more pronounced when coupled with geographic isolation or socioeconomic disadvantage. And of course, many of the women, many migrant women, suffer from language barriers and social isolation that can limit the awareness of their rights and the available services. And that's where interpreters can really help. Okay. As I don't know if it was Erika or the other person who spoke, or even Suellen, one of the three has mentioned that not any interpreter is valid to work in this context. You need quality interpreting. And this is not only said by us, by me, and by other scholars, it's also said by legislation. There is, again, a lot of legislation on the need to quality interpreting for victims of family or gender-based violence, as I like to call it. I'm just giving you two legal texts that contemplate this need for specialization. All the legislation that I have been mentioning, even though I didn't go into detail, but most of this legislation talks about the right of victims to be informed and to receive integrative, means comprehensive assistance, like medical, social, psychological, legal assistance, including linguistic assistance. So agents are important, interpreters are important agents into this assistance process for victims, okay? And all the legislation also says that all agents, all public service providers who work with victims in the police, in the courts, prosecutors, social workers, etc., must have specialized training in gender violence, gender and equality issues. But what about interpreters? Have you ever heard of any document or any legal document talking about the need for a specialization? Okay. Well, in Spain, certainly not. Okay. In Spain, you only have a right to an interpreter, a free interpreter, in the courts and in the police, not in the shelters, not when you go to the doctors, not when you go to social centers. You don't have a right to a free interpreter, only in the courts and in the police. And even in the courts and in the police, you don't need any qualifications to become an interpreter. You don't need any accreditation. You only need to say that you speak Chinese or that you speak Arabic, and then if you're needed, you are hired, right? Well, as you can imagine, this is an incredible problem, and this creates a lot of suffering for the victims, because you can have wonderful social workers, you can have wonderfully trained doctors, you can have really good lawyers, very good judges, all trained and specialized and ready to help. But if the critical link, which is the interpreter, does not have that training, does not have at least the same training as these other agents, the help will not get to the victim. And she will stay in isolation, she will stay, carrying the backpack, full of those stones that we mentioned before. Well, Australia, as usual, is a pioneer in this sense. And I have been showing this slide on the Royal Commission on Family Violence report. I've been showing this slide now all over Europe. I've been to conferences in Finland, in Belgium, in Spain, of course, in Italy, in Greece, and I've been telling everyone, look, in Australia, there is an official document that says that professional accreditation standards for interpreters should be amended to incorporate minimum requirements relating to understanding the nature and dynamics of family violence. Well, I've heard some people very pessimistic here saying, well, yeah, that's only in paper, that is not implemented yet. Well, things are slowly coming, but this is a great step. Believe me, you know, when I show this to other people in other places in the world, you know, they are amazed. So congratulations to all of you. I suppose you had a lot to do, you know. Laws don't just come out of nothing, you know, they come out of lobbying, pressure, okay? And this is something that you professional interpreters have probably been, you know, asking the government to recognize. Well, as you can see again, one recommendation 160 of this report says again that interpreter courses require understanding of the nature and dynamics of family violence. Well, even though I fully agree with this recommendation, I think we do not only need understanding of the nature and dynamics of family violence to become specialized in gender violence. We need a little bit more, okay? And that's what I'm going to try and explain to you today. What the needs for specializations are according not to me, but the research that we carried out in Spain that Suelen was mentioning before, the SOSVIX project. This was a project that we did with European Union funding, and the objectives were, on the one hand, to see what are the communication needs of victims in the different services. And the second objective of the project was to create training material for interpreters who are specialized in this, working in this context, okay? So you have all the materials in the website, which is SOS, is down here. And you can, unfortunately, most of it is in Spanish, but we are beginning to translate some of it. We have already translated a part of the book with the help of Dr. Lavac from Monash University, and so it's already available, and we are planning to translate a little bit more into English. Well, as I said before, the project was carried out by 9 Spanish universities with the help from a lot of institutions, legal institutions, social workers, nurses, doctors, a lot of people, a lot of agents came on board, and they were really, really enthusiastic about helping us to define what their needs were, and to also, you know, create some materials to give a response to these needs. Now, the project was carried out in 3 stages. The first one was the research stage. We did not want to have that approach that sometimes we have in the academia of just writing whatever we think is right. We wanted to go to the field and find out the needs and then do the resources, then do the materials, right? The second part, the second stage of the project was the creation of resources. We created resources for victims, for agents, and for interpreters. And also, you know, the third one, the dissemination of results, which I'm still doing nowadays. Well, the research was carried out. During the first year of the project, we held 2 workshops with experts from the legal, the police, the healthcare, and the social fields. We also carried out a questionnaire that was answered by more than 600 agents, okay? And we did not just send this questionnaire in the internet and got people to answer. We actually telephoned them before, and we found out whether they had worked with women, with migrant women, with problems with language, and they said yes. Then we send them the questionnaire, right? And even being so selective, we managed to get 600 responses. So that was, you know, a lot of work, but very, very good results. We also did a survey, a Delphi survey with interpreters to try and see what they thought were the main training needs. And finally, we held out in-depth interviews with experts in the field of gender violence assistance, and also with migrant women and survivors who do not speak the language. And there were 12 interviews. It might not look like a lot, but doing 12 interviews to survivors is something complicated. There are a lot of ethical issues and a lot of problems sometimes. But because we had a lot of support from a lot of professionals, we managed to do these 12 interviews. Okay, so the main findings from the research were that interpreters were not always available. We actually, I was telling a group of people that I met on Wednesday that sometimes when we went to have our interviews with the victims, they said, oh, you have an interpreter, can we use your interpreter? Because this woman has to prepare the court case that she has next week, and we have not been able to speak to her, okay? So that was really, you know, shocking to find out that. And then we also found out that when interpreters are provided, many times they're unqualified, unprofessional, and this creates a lot of communication problems because communication turns inappropriate, inefficient, inaccurate, and sometimes even harmful for the woman, for the victim. We also realized that there was an absolute lack of procedural safeguards, that victims' rights were often violated, and something that was really hard to find is that victims do not trust the system. Nearly 30% of the agents replied that they always or almost always used the same interpreter for victim and aggressor. Can you imagine how the victim might feel, you know, if she knows that the same person is working for her aggressor? Well, if we are professional interpreters, we probably think that that's, you know, we are impartial, that doesn't, you know, affect us because, you know, we can interpret for both. But for the victim, it has a lot of impact. Of course, public resources are wasted, and, you know, because most of the interpreters in Spain are not professionals, 32% of agents said that they were not sure that the victim had fully understood the message. Can you imagine again how frustrating this is for a lawyer who has been talking to a victim through an interpreter and has the feeling that she has not understood anything, okay? Well, I just want to read this testimony. I'm going to leave it there for you to read. This is a testimony from a Moroccan survivor on what she thought an interpreter should be. In this testimony, you can feel, on the one hand, the feeling of isolation this person talks about. Many of them refer to their situation as being in an island, okay? And feeling that the interpreter was somehow, you know, the only bridge to get them to the other side of the island. But, you know, in order to have a stable bridge, a proper bridge, they said, the person needs to know, needs to be prepared, trained. It is important to choose the right person, somebody select, prepared, available, and with a gift. Well, this is the victim's words. With all the data and with all the research that we did, we created, as I said, a book for agents on how to work with interpreters in gender-based violence context. We also created some leaflets and posters for victims in 6 or 7 languages, 6 actually. And then we created a video that has been really good, and it's even been used here in Australia. Yeah? Through Erica, we got somebody from some nurses education center got in contact with us to ask us if they could use this material for their training because they found it really good. In the video, we try to make women identify themselves with situations of violence, not just showing, you know, kind of physical aggressions, but all the different types of violence. We also told them, okay, if you are a victim or if you think you're suffering from gender-based violence, there are lots of services that you can avail of. And, you know, we had the participation of, you know, the judge, a prosecutor. They were all real agents who participated in the video. And then we tell them, if you cannot speak the language, you can always ask for an interpreter, especially in the courts and in the legal system. And we also tell them in the video what to expect from a professional interpreter and what is the difference between having a professional interpreter and having a friend or a relative to go and interpret for them. So we believe that this video is useful. It's in English, so you can as well use it as well if you find it useful. Now, the resources that we created for interpreters, which is what I'm more interested in, and I'm going to explain to you in more detail, are a book on the one hand, and this book is very much set in the Spanish context, but as I said, it has a few chapters that are more general, and they have been translated into English. And we also have a web page which is full of material as well for interpreters. They're all available, free of charge, of course, at the project website. So let's see what we think are the interpreters' needs. This is all I'm going to tell you is based on the findings of the project, and there are some publications by Toledano and myself and Abril, Mabel Abril, who was a colleague. And we believe that apart from all the general training on community interpreting, all the competencies that we need to become community interpreters, interpreters also need to understand, and I have quoted, like this is taken from the Royal Commission, the nature and dynamics of family, and I write gender-based violence, of course. We also think that we learn to identify and react to psychological and emotional factors. This is a huge part where we need specific training because it has a lot of consequences, as we will see. And we also need to acquire a deep knowledge of the multi-agency and multidisciplinary environment. Remember, victims have a right to comprehensive assistance, okay? From the doctors to the social workers to the courts. And it is very advisable that you have the same interpreter working in all the context, because otherwise, you know, you have another person and adding more people, okay, to the encounters, and this also creates a lot of stress on the victim. So we need to have knowledge of all the disciplines and all the agencies that intervene when assisting gender violence victims. So the first one, which is the nature of gender-based violence, we need to understand and recognize that gender-based violence is a cultural and a structural reality in society, which can only be fully understood if we look at it from a gender perspective, okay? Now, working with the gender perspective means understanding that gender and gender-based violence, not as an individual experience originating in the differences between sexes, but as a product of social and cultural conceptions that attribute different roles to men and women. Now, we need to understand this in order to be able to understand how violence against women originates. Now, these conceptions that I've just mentioned have historically created a patriarchal social structure that places women in an inferiority or subordination role to men, and this is quite clear in our society. And the socialization process that we all go through since we are little children condition us to accept such a division of roles and to consider them as normal, okay? So women are supposed to stay at home, to look after the children. Men are the ones that go out to work. Men, you know, have some privileges in certain societies. Things are changing, I know, but this is what historically has been happening. Okay, in this context is where gender-based violence sociocultural phenomenon originates and in turn acts as an instrument for perpetuating the same. So through fear, through threats and coercion, we learn to behave ourselves the way we are supposed to, because we have to comply with the role that society has given us. Gender-based violence then acts as an instrumental dimension wherein individuals consciously or unconsciously many times, justify it as an instrument to maintain this culturally based order and to correct any transgressions or subordination to the male gender. Now, this is not said by me, this is said by many people, scholars, researchers who have been researching into this phenomenon. So, better stay the way we are. Gender violence becomes an instrument to keep the status quo in society, okay? Another aspect that interpreters need to understand is that gender violence does not have just one form, okay? A woman who is suffering from gender violence may not only suffer from physical abuse, but she might suffer from emotional abuse. Financial abuse is another important, very important aspect. Psychological abuse, which so many times is so difficult to prove, okay? And of course, sexual and physical abuse. But if you remember the definition of the United Nations, even threats of these abuses cause pain, cause suffering, and they are also a crime. Okay? So this is very important, and this is something that interpreters need to understand. Okay. We also need to understand the nature of gender-based violence and how it usually happens, especially in the family or in the couple relationship. This was described by Lenore Walker in the 1970s. And she explains that we have, you know, the honeymoon phase. You meet somebody and you fall in love with that person. Then there is a build-up of tension in the relationship. It doesn't just happen overnight, okay? And then there is the explosion phase. And then again is the, I'm so sorry, this will not happen again. And the woman believes that. And what is even worse, I was speaking to a friend of mine who is a judge, and she was saying most of the women, 90% of the women, feel really guilty that they are triggering that, explosion phase. Okay? Again, I'm telling him about his mother. Again, I'm telling him about these things that he doesn't like, and that is why he explodes. Okay? So many women find excuses for this situation because, you know, they are not able to see the reality. Okay? Now, it is very interesting to the boiling frog metaphor to understand, because I think it's applicable to this phenomenon as well. If you put a frog in boiling water, the frog will jump out immediately, okay? But if you put a frog in a little warm water and she feels really comfortable and it's lovely and it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter and she doesn't even realize, okay? By the time the frog feels the heat, she's not able to jump out of the boiling pan, okay? And this is something that happens to victims, and interpreters have to understand this, because otherwise sometimes we are confronted with a person who is there in a situation of violence and we say, why don't you get out of that? But it's impossible, the person is paralyzed. There is no possibility to jump out at that stage, because this was a gradual process. And it took some time to get to where to the present situation. So interpreters have to be aware of this. It is very necessary that we understand that we can see women through the different stages and through the different situations. So it is important then for interpreters to be aware of the socio-cultural aspects of gender violence in order to understand its origin and usual dynamics, and to identify the individuality of the victim, okay, and her personal experience of abuse. We need to understand that this is a social phenomenon, it's a structural phenomenon, but it has individual manifestations, and every woman is going to be different, okay? Now, Interpreters also need to understand not only the victim's culture and her idea of gender-based violence, but also the stage of the violence cycle she's in and the forms of violence that she's experiencing. Now, sometimes it is very distorting to see a woman who has already been there last month, has suffered, physical aggression, and she's coming back to say that everything is wonderful, that everything is really good, that, they have patched up and there is no problem anymore. For us as interpreters, this is very hard to understand sometimes, but this is something that has been studied, that is a phenomenon that occurs, and this is something that we need to be conscious about. Now, interpreters also should understand that the victim may narrate her experience of violence with apparent indifference and apathy even, okay? And they can even justify it. And this can be a reflection that violence has been internalized and should never be considered as false testimony, as a proof of false testimony, okay? Because, if they had come before to make a report and to say that, they were in this terrible situation, and tomorrow they come to say, that they're fine, many lawyers, many judges even, would tend to think, oh, well, she's just making it up, right? This is something that we need to understand, that this happens, and that is normal, okay? Without specialized knowledge of gender-based violence, interpreters run the risk of just translating words and losing the meaning if they limit themselves to the propositional levels of the message by losing, and thereby losing, the pragmatic value of the expression. So many times we are told that we do not interpret words, that we interpret meaning. And this is, this becomes very meaningful here, okay? We have to actually get the message across. And to do that, we need training, we need a specialization. Now, another very, very, very important part of the training is to understand that an awareness about the reality of gender-based violence can lead interpreters and other agents, not only interpreters, but the other agents too, to prejudices and preconceived ideas, and even to prejudge and form an opinion about the victim, often unconsciously, from misconceptions about that eventually disqualify or even blame the victim. Now, we are all subject to myths and prejudices. I mean, nobody can say, I am totally free. We are the products of society, we watch television, we love romantic films, we think that the world, should be perfect. And this is something that interpreters need to be aware of, okay? That we have preconceived ideas, that we do have ideas in our head that may interfere with our work as interpreters. Now, if unaware of their own prejudices, interpreters can intensify them not only through the translation that we do, okay, not only by omitting words or by changing the message, but also by our body language, right? Now, if we do not believe somebody, that shows in our body language, okay? If we are thinking, oh, here she comes again, it's like, oh, she's trying to get, something from the state. She's trying to get some help, okay? Because she's been told that she can get some money out of this. These things show, okay? Through nonverbal language, we convey a lot. We convey a lot of our thoughts. We convey a lot of, what we feel. And this is so important. Interpreters need to periodically perform a self-assessment of their own beliefs and values in order to safeguard objectivity while staying alert to the attitudes of others. This is very important too. We may not have these preconceived ideas, but what about if the lawyer has? This happens to me very, very often. This very same judge that I'm telling you about, every time I meet her and we're going to interpret for somebody, she says, oh, be careful, she's really mad, okay? This is the first thing she would say to me, okay? She's a good person after all, and she's a wonderful judge. But preconceived ideas. I remember a forensic doctor as well telling me, oh, this girl, you know, she's a young girl from Turkey, I think. So I don't know her intentions. She thinks she's been abused by this teacher, but I don't really know, okay? So preconceived ideas of others can also make us, interpreters, be influenced. And we have to periodically assess, you know, what we feel, how we feel about it, if we are ready to interpret in this context. Now, to sum up this part about the nature of gender-based violence, we believe specialization should include the thematic competence, of course. We need to have expert knowledge on gender-based violence. We need to have intercultural competence in order to analyze gender violence victims in a specific sociocultural environments. But we also need to have attitudinal competence, right? Regular reviews of our own values and possible prejudices, and also attention to other agents' values and prejudices, which is really, really important. Now, the second pillar of the training that I want to talk to you about is the identification and reaction to psychological and emotional factors. Now, we need to be aware that any encounter with a victim of gender-based violence is going to have a psychological and emotional burden on us, interpreters. This is not like interpreting for somebody that has just been, you know, a tourist and, you know, they've taken away her bag or his bag and he goes to the police to report the theft, okay? This is something totally different and many, many times is going to have a clear impact on us. And that impact will obviously have different effects. Maybe not all of them at the same time, but it can have different effects like difficulties to understand, analyze, and reformulate the message, ethical issues and conflicts, of course, because after all, we are human beings, we are not machines. It would be much easier, I think, you know, if we were some sort of machines, but we are not. We have a heart and a spirit and soul and feelings. And also, it may have impact on our own well-being. And we have to take care of ourselves as interpreters to be able to keep working and escape the burnout symptoms, you know, and which is so terrible and that can happen to anyone. So the first effect that this you know, psychological and emotional burden can have on us is the difficulties to understand, analyze, and reformulate. Now, these victims many times have experienced feelings of guilt, shame, and fear, and many times they have very low self-esteem, okay? Now, it has been proved as well that the long-term effects of sustained periods of violence cause a progressive deterioration in the victim's mental state, okay? Now, which is aggravated when she has to relive her experience again and again and again, right? So this is something that is mentally undermining the victim, of course. So she can have a lot of difficulties to express herself, to narrate her experience, and that is why in this context, interpreters may have similar challenges to those that you find in the field of mental health. And you know, I know that Professor Labac has also made some guidelines for mental health interpreting, so they're really helpful as well, you know, when working with victims, some of them. The victim may be giving a disjointed, stuttering speech. She might even cry sometimes. But we have to try and transmit that deficient original speech the way it is, because this is going to tell the service provider what condition the victim is in. okay? And this is so crucial. This is so crucial. Now, it is crucial to assess the risk in police settings, for example, right? The police has to understand what the situation is, what the real situation is. And if we try to make the statement very orderly, very nicely, the police will not understand, you know, the danger that, you know, this person is in, right? So this is a very important aspect, and interpreters have to take it into account, of course. Interpreters also need to analyze the pace of the narrative and the paralinguistic features. We need to understand the meaning of silence, the pauses that the victim makes. Sometimes they are essential for the service provider to understand again, and we should not interpret anything. We should be quiet as well. But other times, you know, we can use them to interpret as well. Okay? So we have to decide and we have to understand what the meaning of that pause and that silence is at a particular, you know, point of the conversation with the victim. Interpreters, of course, need to have a great capacity for analysis, concentration, and memory, but we also have to master the different skills like chuchotage or note-taking to understand when we have to use one or the other, okay? Sometimes we are taking notes and the victim gets really nervous that we are writing down things. So that moment, maybe it's better to turn to whispering, right? So that she doesn't get distracted or nervous by the fact that we are taking down notes. Now, the ethical issues and conflicts that may appear in this context are huge, as you can imagine, of course. But I think interpreters, first of all, need to understand that the victim's emotional state and the nature of the facts declared may have an impact on them. I wrote may, but I should have written will have an impact on them, because nobody is a block of ice. If you're not a block of ice, you are going to feel for the person. Interpreters might be overwhelmingly tempted to identify with the victim and to comfort her. Okay? This is something that is in our nature. We're human beings. We see somebody suffering and we like to comfort that person. At the same time, we really know that success in interviews with gender-based violence victims greatly depends on the establishment of a trust relationship between all parties concerned and on the empathy of the agents involved. Now, women who have been through these situations are really, really sensitive to feelings, okay? So if they do not feel that we believe them, that we are at an empathy level with them, they will not speak. And that will be the end of the conversation. And that will be the end of interpreting, okay? So if we want them to speak, we need to show empathy. That doesn't mean we have to lose our neutrality and our objectivity, blah, blah, blah. But we need to show that we understand them by our body language, by our looks, by whatever means we want. But if we do not do that, there will be no communicative situation whatsoever. And this has been, you know, tried out, experienced, and it happens, you know, practically always. Interpreters should be alert to the reactions and refrain from excessive paternalism. We are sometimes very paternalistic and try to help, but this is something that we should refrain, and instead of that, develop an objective empathy that would allow communication with the victim, as I said. And then, interpreters need to understand their role and how far they can intervene, okay? Now, during the SOSVIC's focus groups, this thing came up again and again and again. And we realized that, as it happens in other community interpreting context, doctors, for example, were interested in getting the message out of the victim. They did not care so much about accuracy or precision. They just wanted the victim to speak. So somehow they asked interpreters to help them to do that. That is the purpose of the communicative situation with the doctors. With the social workers, it was quite similar, right? In the legal field, is the opposite. You find, the judge, the prosecutors, the lawyers telling you that they just want a translation word by word, okay? So how do you marry all those interests? You have to know the purpose of the encounter, and you have to negotiate sometimes with the agent what the purpose of the encounter is. Now, the well-being of the interpreters is something that has to be also taken into account. Interpreters may often have to translate dramatic testimonies, descriptions of violent actions that may end up causing secondary traumatic stress. And I think today we have a presentation on this issue, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details here. But we have to know that we are not the only ones. Everybody who works in this context, they have the same traumatic experiences, and they also suffer from this stress. The difference with interpreters is that we speak in the first person. We're putting voice to the person, okay? So that has a different effect, because it is not somebody else, it's me. And suddenly, you become the person. And that has got a lot of impact on us. And this is why we have to deal with it from the interpreting point of view, not from the doctor's point of view, not from the psychologist's point of view. Because they do also have to deal with all these issues, but at a different level, totally different level. Now, interpreters also must avail of self-help strategies and stress management techniques. Now, this is very, very important that we have some wellness plan. I believe when I went to Canada 3 or 4 years ago, I had a meeting with interpreters who work in this with victims, and one of the ladies was telling me, oh God, I feel, after I translate for victims, I feel so afraid of all men, and I'm always telling my daughters to be careful. She had become really paranoid, So this is a fear that we have, this is something that can happen to us as interpreters, and we have to really think that the world is full of wonderful men, of course, I mean, most of them are absolutely fantastic, especially the ones here. Now, apart from these effects, interpreters need to work on the assertiveness. This is a field where you need to be assertive, because you can also, you can be led by one, by the agents, by the victims, by a lot of different emotions, and you need to know your role. You need to be assertive. You need to know what you want to do in that situation. You also need to have some control of your autocontrol, control of your breathing, control of your emotions, control of everything, because some of these interviews are really, really long. I don't know here, but in Spain, for example, a risk assessment interview with the police can take up to 4 or 5 hours. Okay, so you need to be prepared. You need to have some techniques. You need to overcome your tiredness, your hunger. You need to go to the toilet. All these things have to be taken into account. Aguilera, in 2005, in the book that I showed you before, in the Black Book, has got an excellent chapter for those who read in Spanish about, these techniques, these self-strategies and stress management techniques. Unfortunately, I think this one is not been translated yet. Okay, so as our colleague, the late Sedat Mulaying and Professor Lai said, interpreting and translating profession is complicated by the fact that it always takes place within another professional activity. And I'm going to explain a little bit this last aspect of the training, how we work with other disciplines. Now, as I said before, victims are entitled to comprehensive assistance in the social services, of course in the healthcare, in police, in courts, etc. And it's always advisable to have the same interpreter for the same victim. But interpreters may be needed in the different fields, of course, in the different contexts, and also in the different stages, right? So you might see the woman at the beginning, when she's beginning to be treated, when she's beginning to get the treatment, and you will see her all along, okay? So, you know, you need to know the different stages. This requires, on the one hand, thematic competence. You need to know a little bit, you don't need to be a doctor, a lawyer, a social worker, a psychologist, but you need to know the basics of medicine, of law, of psychology. You also need to know the terminology used in every field, because you are going to be working with a specialist. And as you know, they consider their language to be normal language, okay? So they're not going to adapt it for us. The different documents and protocols, and again, I put that notes as big agents for me to remember to tell you. When we had the interviews with agents, they insisted that interpreters know the protocols that they follow, because they don't want to explain that every time an interpreter comes. They said, oh, we lose so much time telling the interpreter, okay, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that, and then we're going to take the woman here, and then we're going to have an interview, and then she has, okay, so we should have a little bit of knowledge of the protocols, of the documents that they handle, so, you know, that we don't have to be explained again and again and again. The legislation is very important to know the legislation, because you can only explain things properly if you understand it, okay? You can only explain rights to a victim if you fully understand what the rights mean, okay? And then I put I highlighted this objective of the communicative situation. We need to know what that person, that professional person, wants to get out of that encounter, okay? One of the things that, one example that I always give is, for example, the different purposes of therapy, psychological therapy, and psychologically forensic assessment, for example, right? Now, for therapy, you want to help the person, you want to treat the person, okay, psychologically. For an assessment, psychological forensic assessment, you want to find out the state of the person, and sometimes you even want to know if she's telling the truth. And that is going to be through the way we interpret. So the victim, the psychologist, is going to assess, you know, the validity or the validity of the victim's statement by the way we translate. And many times the cues that they have to know that are the way the victim speaks. Not what she says, but the way she says it, okay? When you are making something, when you are making up a story, you know the story by heart, and you tell the story in a very orderly manner. If it is something that has happened to you, you are completely chaotic when you are explaining it, for example. And you also mix it with things like, I felt, I smelled, I remembered, okay? So these things are really, really as important as telling the facts. So this is something interpreters have to be taken into account when we are translating in psychological forensic evaluations, for example. So knowing the objective of the communication situation is absolutely necessary and paramount, I believe. Well, I've written here this word impact because this is a new project that we have applied for. to the European Union. We applied it for it last year and it was rejected. So, but we are insisting, and until we get it, we are not going to stop, because we would like to find out the best way to work with all the agents and with all the disciplines, right? So we're going to start, seeing, poor collaboration between different agencies and see how we can improve it. And this is the objective of the new project that we have applied for. And I hope in 2 or 3 years' time, I will come back to Melbourne and I will explain to you the results of the new project impact. I just want to remind you of the main points of my presentation, and the first one is, of course, violence against women is a form of gender-based discrimination, and it is a violation of human rights, of course, that affects many women all over the world. Remember, 1 in 3 in the European Union. Migrant and refugee women are an especially vulnerable group. There are no figures, really, but if we had to put figures to these, we would find out that they would be really huge. In order to guarantee their rights, they need to understand and be understood. They have a right to information, of course, but also to be understood. Victims who do not speak the language of the host country need interpreters to exercise their rights. So imagine our responsibility. Okay, we are the guarantors of the victims' rights in this sense. And interpreters, and I've written here, like any other service providers, it's not that we are different, we are just another agent in the assistance chain. We need to be qualified and specially trained, of course, to assist the victims and survivors of gender-based violence. Now, these are in very small letters some of the references that I've mentioned here. And this is, thank you very much for your attention.